He was the most famous explorer of his era. South and North America were named after him.
He's actually the key character, the great unknown in the Age of Discovery.
His report of a new world was a bestseller across Europe. While searching for the Spice Islands of Asia, he stumbled upon a new world.
He begins to realize that he has found something completely new, something that has never been represented on a map of the world before.
Inspired by his name, Amerigo, a German cartographer labeled this new continent America. Vespucci himself has been all but forgotten by history, so why does America still carry his name? Florence, stronghold of the Renaissance in Italy, and in 1451, birthplace of Amerigo Vespucci. It was the city's heyday as a center for trade, science, and art. The uncrowned rulers of the city were the Medici, a Florentine family who had profited from international banking. The Medici also financed expeditions to explore new trade routes. Many patrician families were involved, including the Vespuccis. The church of San Salvatore Ognissanti was their family church. In it is a fresco. Under the protective cloak of the Madonna is the young Vespucci. To the left of him, his uncle, Giorgio Antonio. The respected scholar was a member of the San Marco Dominican Monastery, a center for humanistic studies. It was through him that Amerigo gained access to the latest scientific discoveries.
Amerigo learns Latin from his uncle and reads the works of the ancient philosophers as well as the travelogues of Marco Polo. But most importantly, he is introduced to the studies of geography and astronomy that were both very popular in Florence at the time. The humanists were trying to reconcile ancient ideas about the world with modern information as more and more reports were coming in, especially from Portuguese discoverers and the people traveling along the trade routes.
Nevertheless, Amerigo began his service as a bookkeeper and merchant in the Palazzo of Medici Riccardi. Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici was overseer of the family's far-flung investments. But business in Spain was not going well. There appeared to be irregularities. A trusted man was needed to keep an eye on things. Only one employee fit the bill, Amerigo Vespucci. He was given the task of supervising the bank's next major project.
È meglio che tu vada a Sevilla.
The Medici's Spanish business was in Seville, and this is where Amerigo Vespucci was sent. A welcome challenge for the nearly 40-year-old. For Amerigo, this was a temporary farewell to Florence, albeit for an indefinite period of time. He could not have known that he would never see the city on the River Arno again. He had long pored over books and maps, dreaming about travel. Now, at last, he could see with his own eyes places he had only heard about in business reports. As a Spanish inland port on the Guadalquivir River, Seville was gaining in importance at the time. Ships sailed from here and returned, ships belonging to explorers, traders in silk fabrics and spices. And wherever they'd been, the seafarers brought back news of foreign lands and great discoveries. Equipping a fleet was an enormous logistical effort and a major financial risk, given the dangers of a sea voyage. Ships had to be hired, crews taken on. Supplies for many months had to be stowed away on board. The duration of a voyage was usually impossible to estimate. Vespucci worked in Seville with Giannotto Berardi, a wealthy Florentine merchant and slave trader. Together, they equipped expeditions in whose financing the Medici were also involved. It was a joint venture like this that financed the first voyage made by Christopher Columbus, who had long been searching unsuccessfully for financiers. At the time, voyages of discovery always pursued economic interests, a research topic of historian Consuelo Varela.
Berardi was a very wealthy merchant who, through a series of circumstances, became Christopher Columbus's partner. And Vespucci was an associate of Berardi, and so the business relationship between the three was born. Berardi was a slave trader, and he used all of his money to finance Columbus's first voyage, and part of his second.
None of those involved could have guessed that this first voyage of Christopher Columbus would become the most famous voyage of discovery in the history of the world. Vespucci was fascinated by Columbus's project and became an enthusiastic supporter of his idea of reaching Asia via the western route. The known world at that time was limited to just 3 continents. No one in the Western world had heard of either Australia or the huge island kingdom in the Pacific, and certainly nothing at all about a gigantic continent somewhere to the west. This is why Columbus was convinced that if he headed west, he would reach the east of Asia. It couldn't be very far. Astronomer Toscanelli had calculated the distance. Today, we know that the journey via the western route is more than twice as far.
Toscanelli's calculations of the extension of the Earth are so far off, probably because they're based on the extremely vague information provided by Marco Polo. In order to compute an east-west distance, longitudes must first be determined. But this was only possible in theory at the time. To rely on distance calculations that were so sketchy was a risky thing to do.
On August the 3rd, 1492, Columbus set sail, hoping to return with riches and achieve fame. After a lengthy stopover on the Canary Islands, he reached one of the islands of the Bahamas on October 12th, Cuba a little later, and then today's Haiti on December 6th. There he founded the Hispaniola settlement. Columbus was convinced that he had found the sea route to India. Upon his return, he was celebrated for his epoch-making discovery. In the Plaza de España in Seville, this moment was captured visually for time immemorial. A tile painting shows Columbus being appointed Viceroy of India at a reception of the Spanish crown. He had brought with him indigenous people, pearls and exotic fruits, but he had not discovered the promised treasures. So in September 1493, he set off on his second voyage, from which he was only to return 3 years later. The expectations of the Spanish rulers were high. Bishop Fonseca, the highest spiritual dignitary, received Columbus on his return. At his side was Vespucci, representing Berardi. Both inspected the cargo. 1/5 of everything belonged to the crown. But, to their great disappointment, Columbus had once again brought back little of real value.
As Berardi suspected, he was ruined. Shortly before his death, he drew up his will. It has not been preserved, but we have a note in which he stated that Columbus still owed him 180,000 maravedis.
180,000 maravedis.
He left the collection of this gigantic sum to his executors, especially Amerigo Vespucci. But Vespucci was more interested in a friendship with Columbus. The Florentine accountant still dreamed of sailing westwards himself. The opportunity soon arrived. Not with Columbus, however. He had fallen from grace. But with an ambitious young nobleman, Alonso de Ojeda, one of the captains who had sailed with Columbus. The mission given to Ojeda by Bishop Fonseca was that he should finally find the legendary land of pearls that Columbus had spoken about, and to establish trade relations with Asia across the Atlantic. In the famous Royal Portuguese Library in Rio de Janeiro, Brazilian historian Karen Lisboa has been researching the controversial role of Amerigo Vespucci.
Vespucci was not primarily driven by the discovery of new territories, but initially by commercial interests. It was about the search for gold and silver, and of course also about finding access to valuable spices. But then another motive gradually gained the upper hand. He wanted to distinguish himself as a cartographer, cosmographer, explorer, and navigator.
In May 1499, a Spanish fleet of 4 ships left the port of Cadiz, as Columbus had 6 years earlier, in search of the spice lands via the westward route towards Asia. 2 years earlier, Vasco da Gama had set out for India via the eastern route around Africa, on behalf of the Portuguese crown. The race for the fastest route to the spice lands was now in full swing. Ojeda had supreme command over the Spanish fleet. But why was Vespucci, of all people, traveling with him? A man in his late 40s without any previous seafaring experience at all.
It actually became an advantage for him that he was used to calculating with money as a mathematician. At that time, navigation was mainly according to the stars, and the map was a help. The stars also helped, as well as calculating the constellations.
For orientation at sea, the most important method at the time was dead reckoning. Speed was determined using the common log, a rope marked with knots at regular intervals. They counted how many knots ran off the coil over a specific period of time. An hourglass was used to determine the beginning and end of this period of time, and the speed was then calculated in knots. And Vespucci kept a record of the measurement data for navigation. Coastal navigation had been practiced for centuries. Seafarers orientated themselves with the help of the coastline, birds, reefs, plants, and aquatic animals. But this is impossible when sailing across the open ocean. In the Zeiss Major Planetarium in Berlin, Dr. Felix Lüning, expert on the history of navigation, shows how people found their way on the open seas.
Amerigo Vespucci's navigation was, of course, not as sophisticated as today's. Sextant, chronometer, all of that was unknown, as was radio direction finding. What they did have was a compass and this device, the Jacob staff, so called as it resembled somewhat the walking stick used by the St. James pilgrims. The device is very simple. It could do everything. It was an angle and distance instrument. You put this long main staff section, divided like a tailor's L-stick, to your eye, and with the lower edge of the transom at the horizon, you moved the transom until the upper edge touched the star whose altitude you wanted to gauge, preferably Polaris. And then you could read the angle value on the scale, and if you were aiming at Polaris, at the same time you had the angular height of Polaris, and thus the latitude of the ship's location.
Polaris, the North Star, is directly above the North Pole. Its angle above the horizon can be determined not only with Jacob's staff, but also with an astrolabe or quadrant. If the star is directly above a ship, it forms an angle of 90 degrees with the horizon. If the North Star is at the same level as the horizon, it forms an angle of 0 degrees. This made it possible to determine precisely what latitude the ship was on, north of the equator. If this angle remained unchanged, then the ship was sailing on a single latitude, on a straight course to the west. On his return from his journey, Vespucci wrote to his Florentine employer, "I set my course across to the Fortunate Islands, now called the Canary Islands, and directed our bow to the southwest." Vespucci wrote as if he were the leader of the expedition. Captain Ojeda and other expedition members are not named at all. Later authors who criticized Vespucci's reports as unreliable denounced this as imposture, as after all, he was only on board as navigator. But there's an explanation for this. The Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna houses one of the most important collections on the history of the discoveries. Curator Robert Wallish has devoted himself to verifying the reliability of Vespucci's texts as a source by examining them philologically. He explains the seeming inconsistencies.
Vespucci also doesn't mention the names of the boat's pilot. He writes this letter in the tradition of an ancient essay letter. The verbal records in this letter are designed to communicate with the addressee. And this addressee is not in the slightest bit interested which noble Spanish and Portuguese families have managed to buy their way into a captain's post here. He's only interested in the spectacular and exotic information.
After 44 days, the fleet reached land. Today, we know that this was the northern coast of South America. The question now was, should he sail to the north or the south? Ojeda and Vespucci decided on both directions. Ojeda had made a contractual commitment to find gold, silver, precious stones and pearls as quickly as possible. He sailed north with 2 ships, in the assumption that this was where he would find the pearl country of Columbus. Vespucci, on the other hand, would lead the other 2 ships south along a previously uncharted route. The worldview in Vespucci's mind as he traveled south can now be seen in the National Library of Florence. They have a number of geographical textbooks, including one from 1478 that belonged to the Vespucci family.
There is a dedication there, partly erased, but it's quite legible here. Augustinus Vespucci.
A further clue is the Vespucci family coat of arms. Librarian David Speranzi explains what is so special about the book.
This map represents a Ptolemaic planisphere. Ptolemy's geography had been the reference since ancient times and viewed the Indian Ocean as a closed sea. But during the course of the 15th century, new maps were added to the manuscripts and later to the prints of Ptolemy's geography, based on the experience of seafarers that depicted the Indian Ocean as an open sea. As a result, it was Amerigo Vespucci's intention to reach the far side of the Indian Ocean.
On these maps, Vespucci saw the Indian Ocean as open, bounded on the west by Africa, on the east by the Dragon's Tail, a fanciful name for a phantom peninsula that at the time included largely unknown countries. Today, it corresponds roughly to Thailand and Malaysia. Vespucci believed he was already at the tip of this dragon's tail. He would soon find the passage to the legendary Spice Lands. For 4 days and 4 nights, he followed the coast to the southeast. He was fascinated by the exotic natural environment with completely unknown flora and fauna. And a night sky such as he had never seen in Europe. Strange constellations, the Southern Cross. The North Star that he'd used to guide himself by up to now was long gone. He was now in the southern hemisphere. Vespucci had no idea that he was sailing past a gigantic landmass, the 4th largest in the world, and they were still in the upper third of the huge continent. Vespucci decided to explore the mouth of a particularly wide river. It was the Amazon. Vespucci and his crew were the first Europeans to set eyes on the mighty river. But even before they could go ashore, they were spotted by the natives. Hidden and from a safe distance, the indigenous people watched the white men arrive on the beach. Gifts ought to lure the natives out, or so the seafarers hoped.
They had actually arrived in a completely new world, and Vespucci himself writes in his notes not only about the people who lived there, but he reports that more people lived there and more animals, that it was much more species-rich, this new world, than he already knew from Europe at that time.
Vespucci was especially astonished by the fact that the natives wore virtually nothing on their bodies. Unlike the buttoned-up Europeans back home, he wrote, "They walk around as on the day they were born."
When Vespucci spoke of a new world, he was referring to the many languages the indigenous people had, the cultural diversity, the different customs and traditions, a diverse, living culture that could be called primitive. This is what Vespucci tried to emphasize in his report, thereby setting the standards for future travel literature, in which the main aim is to emphasize the exotic, foreign nature of the American continent and its inhabitants.
Vespucci noticed something else. The rivers carried such large quantities of fresh water into the sea that they could not be on an island. They must be on a continent. But at that time, only 3 continents were known: Europe, Africa, and Asia. So he deduced, like Columbus, that he was on the east coast of Asia. But he did not find the passage to the Spice Land, or riches. Given the little progress we were making, we decided to turn the bow back to the northwest and sail northwards. There was probably another reason why Vespucci turned back. He must have realized that he was now in Portuguese territorial waters, with his 2 ships under the Spanish flag, which could be problematic. To settle the conflict between the 2 competing maritime powers on the Iberian Peninsula, the Pope had divided the world into 2 halves in 1494. The Spanish half in the west and the Portuguese half in the east, which is why they speak Portuguese in Brazil today.
It's a crazy situation. At that time, the Portuguese and the Spanish could neither determine their exact position, nor did they know a large part of the earth. They didn't even know what was actually to be found on the other half of the earth. And that's why they were always very uncertain on their voyages of discovery. First of all, they didn't know exactly where they were, and so they didn't know if they were perhaps on the coast of South America in, so to speak, enemy territory.
Vespucci and his crew sailed back over the equator. On their way, time and again, they went ashore, and on these excursions they met local people. Every day, wrote Vespucci, we discovered an infinite number of people. At last they reached the coast of what is now Venezuela. We landed in a natural harbor where we found a village built on the water, like Venice. An observation that the editors of Vespucci's travelogue later brought to life. Vespucci's description gave Venezuela its name, Little Venice. Sometimes the indigenous folk fought back against the foreign newcomers, but these battles were unequal from the start. Arrows and spears against firearms, the natives didn't stand a chance. We put them to flight, killed many of them, and looted their houses, wrote Vespucci. Violence was taken for granted.
In the beginning, the explorers have a skewed sense of honor. On the one hand, it's a disgrace to fail in battle or to capitulate in the face of difficulties, but it's not considered inhuman to burn down Indian huts, kill hostages, and rape women. Brutality is justified by the Christian faith inasmuch as the Indians are considered to be inferior because of their idolatry.
Vespucci's and Ojera's ships met up again and returned to Spain together, with more than 200 slaves, but few riches on board. The voyage was nonetheless a triumph for Vespucci. He had discovered a new landmass, and he was certain that he was on the verge of finding the western route to the riches of Asia. He wanted nothing more than to set off immediately on the next expedition. And indeed, his next letter to his employer in Florence is dated only 9 months later. You will have heard that while I was staying in Seville, I was summoned to the King of Portugal, and that he asked me to prepare for a journey in his service. And again, it was to be an exploratory voyage to the west.
How does Vespucci land up with the Portuguese? After first sharing all his experience on the Spanish side in alliance with Columbus. Well, the Portuguese saw him, a highly educated man, concerned with astronomy and with direct access to the Spaniards' information via a private source, as an ideal scientific spy, a source of information. And for this particular mission, namely the discovery of Brazil and the question, is this a continent or an island, which was a highly political explosive question, they wanted Vespucci on board as an informant. On the one hand, because he was educated in astronomy, and on the other hand, perhaps even more importantly, because he had this political knowledge about what the Spanish knew.
Evidently, in January 1502, after 8 months at sea on the Atlantic, they came across a large bay. They mistook it for the delta of a big river and called it Rio de Janeiro, translated January River. Nature here was abundantly lush. Countless plant species, giant trees, fragrant flowers, and a temperate climate. All this impressed Vespucci deeply. Overwhelmed, he noted, If an earthly paradise is to be found anywhere in the world, it must undoubtedly be not far from this area.
Taking into account the abundance of animals, but also the diversity of people he observed, who seemed to live in harmony with nature, he really did think it was a paradise that he had newly discovered. And presumably it was. Compared to the already densely populated cities in Europe, the European landscapes, which had already been largely exploited and plundered, he found nature here comparatively unspoiled.
But Vespucci gradually realized that he was not able to find the passage to the Indian Ocean. This coast, which they were following southwards, was simply unending. They sailed so far, Amerigo writes, until we reached the dry zone and beyond the equator and the Tropic of Capricorn, so that the South Pole was 50 degrees above my horizon. The statement was debatable. Did Vespucci really reach the Rio de la Plata, or even the coast of Patagonia? It's impossible to prove this today. What is certain is that Vespucci extended knowledge of the Brazilian coast by over 1,000 kilometers. That alone is sensational. There was land that stretched so far south of the equator. Columbus only reached land that was known at the time. After all, he believed he had reached India. He didn't realize that he had encountered something completely new. Vespucci, on the other hand, saw clearly that what stretched out before him was not the eastern tip of Asia, but a new, hitherto unknown, gigantic landmass.
At this point, Vespucci has sailed thousands of kilometers beyond both the known as well as the imagined map with the dragon's tail. After traveling south for some time, he begins to realize that he has found something completely new, something that has never been represented on a map of the world before. And gradually, the coast of the American continent rises up like a ghost out of nothing.
Shortly after Vespucci's return, a travelogue of his was printed in Latin, Mundus Novus, New World. First printed in Augsburg in 1504, the book rapidly became a bestseller. It was translated into all the languages of Europe and repeatedly republished, sometimes separately, sometimes in anthologies.
This tremendous success has something to do with the fact, for one thing, that this is genuinely the text. That is, after all, what is always at stake in an assessment of Vespucci, which explicitly says, unlike any of his other letters, this continent in the south is not identical with Asia, not identical with Europe, and not identical with Africa. So we have discovered a new continent. Nowhere else is this written with such clarity. This is the first publication to say so. That in itself would be enough to make this work significant. It is this combination of detective science, enthusiasm for a paradisiacal new world, combined with the creepiness factor of a few horrific but highly dramatic events. It's the cannibalism, and something that always interested the Europeans, who after all led a rather buttoned-up life back then, permissive sexuality. That is also a theme in Mundus Novus, and one can observe, from then on, it belongs as a standard inclusion in every good travel book.
It was these horrifying and salacious stories that were often reproduced in copperplate engravings, as in these prints, which 100 years later were to illustrate the most famous collection of travelogues of modern times. Sensation sold well. Women who were offered to the foreigners. Cannibalism. Or exotic animals. Embellished with vivid imagination, these were the images that would long shape Europeans' notions of the New World.
Sex and crime sold well then, just as well as it does now, and the publishers picked those images from Vespucci's report that promised to make the most profitable sales. Cannibalism took place among some of the South American tribes, for the most part as rituals in the context of war. and sexual invitations were probably there to enable political alliances. Thus, they are something entirely different from what the Europeans make of them with their hungry gaze, because there was no understanding of certain acts in a cultural or ethnological context.
It is nothing new for writers to embroider the truth to boost sales. Vespucci also came under suspicion of having falsified some parts of his reports. At the beginning of the 19th century, Alexander von Humboldt popularized doubts about the truth of Vespucci's accounts. From then onwards, it was alleged increasingly often that Vespucci was an impostor who had invented his voyages.
It was thought odd that Vespucci spoke of lions in Brazil, for example. Well, that's simply due to the ignorance today about the language of that time. It was perfectly common to name animals you did not know, a species you had never seen, simply by their resemblance to a species you did know. For example, in the early modern period, the common name for giraffe was camelopard, which means camel panther. And an equally obvious equation is to call a predatory cat in the Brazilian jungle a Brazilian lion. From the point of view of a Renaissance author, this is perfectly normal and has been repeated by many other authors. It's only because of the concerted efforts to prove that Vespucci invented things that they became issues.
Erfindungen nachzuweisen, dass man sich bei Vespucci an diesen Dingen gestoßen hat.
Doubting the authenticity of the Mundus Novus, and even worse, accusing Vespucci of swindling, was already philologically fashionable in the 19th century, and even more so at the beginning of the 20th century.
Durchaus auch einer philologischen Mode gefolgt.
In his day, however, Vespucci was unchallenged and even more famous than Columbus. In this way, his report Mundus Novus, New World, also reached the Vosges, at that time part of the Duchy of Lorraine in today's Alsace. At that time, a group of humanist scholars was conducting research in the monastery of the Saint-Dié des Vosges. Among them were the philologist and poet Matthias Ringmann and cartographer Martin Waldseemüller. A new continent, the greatest geographical discovery of all time. None of the current world maps could be correct anymore. They wanted to compile the new geographical knowledge of their time in a reliable world map. For Waldseemüller and Ringmann, ghastly chaos reigned in the cartography of the time. Countless printers had attempted to update maps in an uncoordinated fashion. Over the centuries, numerous errors had crept in. So the two decided on a single goal: to depict a comprehensive and accurate picture of the known world. But how to get hold of precise data for their world map?
The question for Ringmann and Waldseemüller was, where were they going to get reliable information for precise rendering of the coastal outlines and the names of places for their world map? And Vespucci in his Mundus Novus does not contain any of these details because revealing geographic details was considered a crime. Nevertheless, Duke René von Lothringen had just managed to obtain a Portuguese world map on which all the results of the Vespucci expedition are detailed, so Ringmann and Waldseemüller had access to the very latest information.
Although it was punishable by death at the time, maps were copied, stolen, smuggled, and sold. Even top-secret information spread quickly. When their map was finally completed, Ringmann and Waldseemüller were completely overwhelmed. But what should the new landmass be called? In the book accompanying the map, Ringmann wrote, "A fourth continent has been discovered by Americus Vespucius. I don't see why anyone could object to naming this part of the earth after its gifted discoverer Americus, namely Land of Americus or America, since Europe and Asia were also named after women. This map was copied often and served as a template for other later maps. Only one copy of the original has survived. Wolfegg Castle in Upper Swabia played a significant role here. In 1901, a copy previously thought to have been lost turned up here. Bernd Meyer, head of the Royal Art Collections, explains how it came about.
When Martin Waldseemüller's world map arrived here at Wolfegg in the middle of the 17th century, the copy was not listed on any inventory, but placed on a shelf, and there it remained. It was protected here. No one leafed through it, and in this way, the copy at Wolfegg has survived for over 300 years.
The map can still be admired at the castle today, though only as a copy, because the original aroused great interest soon after it was found.
The Americans have been trying for decades to acquire Martin Waldseemüller's world map. They could never do so, as the map was on the German Protected Cultural Heritage List. It was only under Chancellor Gerhard Schröder that permission to export it was granted.
500 years after its publication, the Waldseemüller map became the showpiece of one of the most renowned libraries in the world. In the Library of Congress in Washington, this last remaining copy is guarded like a treasure. To the United States of America, the Waldseemüller map was worth a whopping $10 million.
It's interesting to note how U.S. North Americans morph into the Americans in this story. The name America stands originally only for the continent of South America. North America did not have a name and was later incorporated or grandfathered in, so to speak. Nevertheless, for U.S. Americans, their hegemonial claims to the birth certificate now belongs to them.
As far as we know, Vespucci never learned about the map. After his last expedition, he returned to Spain, although he had just been in the service of the Portuguese. His knowledge of the New World was apparently worth so much to the Spanish that they took him back into their service and even granted him a life of privilege. He married and was appointed head of the Casa de Contratación, the newly founded Royal Trade and Colonial Office. A royal edict demanded that no navigator in service to the Spanish crown could set out for the New World without first having learned map reading and the use of the astrolabe and quadrant from Vespucci.
Obviously, he had acquired so much knowledge that he was later hired by the Spanish crown as a piloto mayor to manage the greatest treasure of the Spanish crown, namely these maps. And that is, in point of fact, an office that was created for him in 1508 and which he held for 4 years, until his death. From this, we can deduce that he must have been a highly respected person in his time, and by no means the impostor or charlatan that he is often accused of being in later literature.
Vespucci became the custodian of the Spanish crown's greatest treasure, the Padrón Real, the secret main Spanish map that served as the template for all Spanish naval maps in the 16th century. It was kept in the Casa de Contratación in Seville. Today, the Archivo General de Indias, where all documents from the Age of Discovery are archived. To illustrate the New World view incorporating the sensational discoveries of Columbus and Vespucci, a map based on Waldseemüller's was used. This is now kept in Vienna.
What we see here is, at first glance, a very modern-looking map of the world. Mainly Europe, Africa, America, South America, Central America. It looks a bit like what you're used to seeing on a modern map. The exciting thing is when one looks more closely at the outer edge of the map. Here we see on the western side that Central America is only a narrow strip at the very edge, because it has not yet been explored more. And on the other side, on the eastern side, if you imagine that you were to glue the map together at the back, immediately in front of Central America lies an island named Zibangi. And that's nothing more nor less than the old Chinese name for Japan.
What was not known at that time was the enormous Pacific Ocean, so Columbus assumed he had found islands that lay directly off the coast of Asia, and Vespucci identified a huge, previously unknown continent to the south, America. Contrary to frequent claims, Vespucci and Columbus were not rivals. Vespucci had not only co-financed Columbus's voyages on behalf of the Medici. Even when Columbus fell out of favor in Spain, Vespucci remained his friend until Columbus's death in 1506. The friends' discoveries would change the world forever.
In the past 500 years, we have actually completely changed the face of the earth. Of course, also in the New World, and especially in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, in the bay where Amerigo Vespucci arrives in 1502. We've built a huge city there, and nature there has been completely changed from the appearance and the atmosphere that Amerigo Vespucci experienced 500 years ago.
Vespucci's reports became the basis for planning the route that Ferdinand Magellan was to take. In 1520, Magellan made the first verifiable circumnavigation of South America. It was definitive proof that this was indeed a new continent.
What Vespucci wrote had an enormous impact on Europe. His view of South America, as he described it, shaped the entire European perception of the so-called New World. So Vespucci is really important. His contribution is fundamental to our understanding of the history of European expansion and the European conquest of the Americas, which eventually led to its Europeanization.
And the myth of America also began with Vespucci.
Naming this double continent after Amerigo Vespucci was by no means incorrect. Rather, over the centuries, he was actually given a false reputation. He probably really wasn't much of an explorer, but he was a cartographer who was able to interpret the discoveries in the first place, and in this respect, he has been unjustly forgotten so far in the history of discovery, and America has rightly been named after him.
Vespucci died in 1512, 5 years after his name appeared for the first time on the map drawn by Waldseemüller and Ringmann. His story is forgotten, his fame faded, but his name lives on. America.